Just wanted to introduce Mr. Jack Puterbaugh, one of our residents here at Walker Place, who has been living here since December. He'll be presenting a little presentation about his life and his journey and some interesting steps along the way and some interesting people that he's met. So here's Jack.
Missy, thank you. And I'm honored to have a chance to chat with all of you folks who have shown up. All of us have a life journey, and we hope that it's a pleasant one, and there's ups and downs, and there's superhighways, and there's country lanes, but we all finally reach a point where most of us who live here are towards the end of our life journey, but that makes Walker Place even a more special place. As you can see, I have finally reached the status of Walker Place because I now have a walker. Anyway, I thought it would be kind of interesting. My life journey started out in Minneapolis, but when I was 6 years old, my dad had lost his job. Of course, it was during the Great Depression, and for some reason they bought a farm in Isanti County, which is about 45 miles north of downtown Minneapolis. Isanti County is kind of an interesting place for two reasons. One, back in the good old days, when the census was taken every 10 years, Isanti County turned out to be the most Swedish county in the entire United States. There weren't any other folks there, although there were 3 German communities in the county, but the vast population was Swedish. The other kind of interesting demographic was that there were no Catholics. The first Catholic, there were very few Catholics. There was a Father Reverend who came into Cambridge, Minnesota in 1940, but it wasn't a church, it was a mission. And finally in 1947, the first Catholic church was built in Cambridge. There are 3 towns in Isanti County: Isanti, Cambridge, and Braham. And Isanti got a Catholic church in the 1970s, and Braham finally got a Catholic church in the 1980s. When I was 6 years old, as I mentioned, we moved to Isanti County. It's a county where my grandfather had immigrated from Sweden in 1882, and my mother's mother and her family had come to Isanti County in 1883. Immigrants. We hear a lot about immigrants today, but most of us come from some kind of immigrant stock, I'm sure. Anyway, one of the things that Dr. Bill talked about, some of the schools he went to in Connecticut when he was here a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure that school does not look like anything in Connecticut. How many people here went to a one-room school? Did anybody go to a one-room school? Oh, there's a few. Thank goodness. Anyway, one-room schools, there were some 65 one-room schools in Isanti County at the very most. This one is the one I went to. It was District 17, known as the Sandy Knoll School. One of the interesting things, again, is that to become a one-room school teacher required only 1 year of education past high school. Can you imagine that today? 1 year past high school, being in charge of 8 grades? In the school there were 3 different sized desks, so as you grew up you went to a bigger desk. The 2 big events in the year, in our school anyway, and I think in most of them, was the Christmas program, where the students put on skits and sang and so on. And then the school picnic at the end of the school year. And one of the nice things about the end of the school year picnic is, remember when ice cream used to come in containers, not packages like we have today? You could have as many scoops of ice cream as you wanted. And that was always a big plus. There were 4 of us who graduated in 1939. There were 3 boys and 1 girl. I was the only student who went on to high school that fall. Because boys, there were three boys and one girl. The two boys, other than myself, that was the end of their education. They were needed on the farm. And the interesting thing about Emily, who was the girl, her parents had moved up to Isani County on April 1st, 1937. And when you talk about being poor, her folks were poor, really poor. And they had an older son, Paul, who was in high school. And the Cambridge High School, where we went to high school, this Cambridge High School didn't provide bus service until the fall of 1937. That meant that rural kids up to that time had to get into town on their own, and usually that meant that you stayed in town during the week and went home over the weekend. And the Cambridge School District charged each of these rural school districts $4 per pupil to ride the school bus. And $4 back in 1939 was a lot of money. Most of us remember that, don't we? Anyway, the Emily's folks could, well, anyway, this local school district, the chairman of the school district, and I will say to his credit, had made it possible for his two boys to go to high school. And so his attitude was, I paid for my kids to go to high school. You figure out how you're going to pay the $4 per month to ride the bus. And my folks and other students' folks would go to the annual school board meeting in July, and the chairman of the school board would agree to pay half of that. So that still meant that you had to pay $2 out of your pocket to ride the school bus. And Emily's parents could afford to send the older brother Paul to school and to ride the bus, but they were so poor that they couldn't afford to pay the $2 a month for Emily, and she got held back a year. And the same thing happened to her brother, Art, who finished, and he got held back a year. But he finished high school in 3 years, so they both finished high school in 1944. Both of them went on to, Art was in the Navy and was able to use the GI Bill to get a college education, and he was became an architect. Emily, who graduated with me, she went to nurses training in the Swedish hospital here in Minneapolis under the nurse cadet program, and she later married a Lutheran minister, and so she got a professional life out of it. But think of the struggle it was for people to really go to high school. That little school represented a lot of woes and misery, but it also involved a lot of teaching and learning. And back in those days, how many people remember when we used to take state board exams? There was a state board exam in geography for 7th grade, and then in 8th grade, you took an exam in math and science and English and political science. And to graduate from 8th grade, you had to pass all those exams. So when they talk about exams today and testing and all that kind of stuff, that's nothing new. That's been around for a long time. Again, my high school class, there were 78 students in my high school class. There were 46 girls and 32 boys. And that again represented the fact that boys didn't go on to high school back in those years because they needed to work on the farm. Today, of course, agriculture and farming is just 1,000% different from back in those days. All right, that's the one stop on my life's journey. Again, I don't wish to make this political, but I was a DFLer, good or bad. I see Jane in the back of the room here, and so we fought some of those wars together. In 1954, the DFL came back into power in terms of the state after 16 years. There were two things in that campaign that were kind of interesting. One is we had a dear friend, Bill Kubitschek, who was in the medical school. He wasn't a doctor, but he was a PhD in physiology, human physiology. Bill came up with the idea of tying all of the TV stations in the state together into one program, so that whenever you turned on your TV set at 8:30 on primary election night and the general election night, you got the same program. There were lots. The program originated in WCCO studios, and there were people who thought their TV set had gone wacko because the stations got lots of complaints because wherever you turned, you got the same program. And they were, well, when Bill first suggested that, the TV station said it couldn't be done, but Kubitschek showed them how it could. And so you tied together the metropolitan stations here, the ones in Duluth, up in Fargo. I remember KELO was one that was in South Dakota. There was Austin and Rochester. There was something, as I recall, there were 11 channels that were tied together in that one program. And the total cost of a half hour of TV time on all of those channels was right at $5,000. Now you can't buy one spot that we see today for $5,000 probably. The other thing that was quite unique in that election was a sample ballot that was cut down the middle, perforated down the middle, and one was for his and one was for hers. And those were broken down to the state legislative level. And Bill Campbell, who later became Walter Mondale's brother-in-law, kind of put that thing together, and how many ballots you needed for this district and how many for that and that for the post office. And the total cost of sending that ballot to all of the post office boxes and numbers in Minnesota was right about $18,500. Can you imagine that today? Anyway, the costs were just different than they were today. Anyway, Governor Freeman took office along with Carl Rolwog, who was the lieutenant governor, Joe Donovan, who was the Secretary of State, Harold, Stafford King, who was a state auditor and was a Republican, was reelected, but he was the only one. The rest was all DFL. So the DFL took over for the first time in its history, because the DFL was formed in 1944. But there hadn't been, the Farmer Labor Party lost out in 1938 when Harold Stassen was elected governor. Anyway, one of the, and I worked for the DFL party starting in 1955. And one of the things that had been planned, and in the meantime, if anyone has questions or comment, please raise your hand. We'd love to have you participate. There was a fundraising dinner planned by the DFL for early December of 1955. And ex-President Harry Truman was to be the main speaker. And we got word that Mr. Truman wasn't feeling well, and so that he was going to have to cancel his speaking date. And I recall going over and in the governor's office, and Governor Freeman was going to contact President Truman. And this was back when the first time I'd ever seen a speakerphone, because Governor Freeman got on the phone with Mr. Truman, and you could hear him. He said, it's coming out of both ends, and Bess won't let me come up there. So Governor Freeman then negotiated a new date for the dinner, which was going to be January the 14th, 1956. And Mr. Truman came up to St. Paul, and he came by train. And we met him at the Union Depot in St. Paul and took him over to the Nicollet Hotel in Minneapolis. And he had just finished writing his book. And so a lot of people came by and greeted him and had him sign the book for him. And he was very gracious about doing it. But by about 11 o'clock, he said, "I'd like to get the room cleared out because I've got to get ready for it." He's going to have a fundraising dinner for his library. And so we cleared everybody out. And the only people left in this hotel suite when we got them all cleared out were Mr. Truman, a fellow who had come in with him by the name of D. Jane Bailey, and a Minneapolis police officer by the name of Don Johnson, and myself. And in this living room of this hotel suite in the Nicollet Hotel, there was a grand piano. And Mr. Truman took off his suit coat, and I recall he had suspenders. And he went over to that piano and knocked off a few notes on it. He got up and he said, "That one sounds like it comes from a French whorehouse." That was Mr. Truman. Anyway, didn't expect that, but we got it. Anyway, the fundraising dinner was successful. Later that fall, again, I had a chance to be with Mr. Truman during a campaign at Marshall, Minnesota. And again, this was at the high school in Marshall, Minnesota, and we were behind the screen for the auditorium. And there was a piano sitting there, too, and he again went and sat down by that piano and knocked off a few notes in the Black Hawk Waltz. Well, that was the way it was. Eleanor Roosevelt came into Minnesota that fall to campaign for Adlai Stevenson, who was also an interesting person who came into Minnesota in the spring of 1956 and ran in the Minnesota state presidential primary. And that was the last presidential primary that was held in Minnesota. The DFL had endorsed Adlai Stevenson for president. And there was also Estes Kefauver, who got involved in the 1956 campaign and really trounced the DFL. And so after that, because the Republicans had taken a beating in 1952 when their favorite candidate was defeated, the legislature repealed the state presidential primary law. So that's the last time that we had a presidential primary, was in 1956. Anyway, that's public life is, and Miss Freeman back there can tell you more about being in public life than I can. But again, in 1960, Governor Freeman ran for governor for re-election and was bucking a trend back in those years. He was re-elected in 1956 and 1958, but it was bucking a trend, and so Governor Freeman lost by about 25,000 votes when the votes were all counted in Minnesota, and John Kennedy won by about 25,000 votes. Governor Freeman, of course, then went into Washington to be the Secretary of Agriculture, which again is a very important job. One of the things that we are facing on a worldwide basis in the years ahead is going to be food, and it's going to be a shortage because we are not producing enough food today to feed the world's population. Anyway, one of the interesting things again that I got involved in was in September of 1963. The Department of Agriculture was sponsoring what was called a Land and Peoples Conference. It dealt with northern Minnesota, northeastern Minnesota, the northern part of Wisconsin, and the upper peninsula of Michigan. And the main speaker at that conference was going to be the president, President Kennedy. One of the interesting things, I got sent out as the advance on that one. And one of the interesting people who lived in Duluth was a person by the name of Gerald Haney. Jerry Haney, again, was one of those people who was one of the greatest generation in terms of World War II. His military service was heroic. Jerry was an attorney, but Jerry could come on very strong and let you know that he was in charge. When I got sent out to Duluth on that mission, I was told that Haney has something with a nun, and and the president doesn't want to do it, so you got to tell him he can't do it. So I arrived in Duluth on a Friday morning, and the first thing I was going to meet with the committee that was working on this conference, and Jerry Haney was there. Before I ever said hello to Haney or greeted him, I said, "Haney, the thing with the nun is out." And so he kind of shook his head and said, "Well, all right." Well, this was Friday. Sunday afternoon, and the event was going to be on Monday. Sunday afternoon, I got a call from Jerry, and he said, "Why don't you come out and have dinner with Eleanor and myself?" I said, "Well, that'd be fine." So he picked me up. I was staying at the Duluth Hotel. So he picked me up and he said, "Well, we got to go out and tell Sister Carmelita that she can't do what she wants to do, wants to present to the president." So we went down a couple of basements, found Sister Carmelita. She was working on this project. It was a piece of art that was about this wide and about a foot high. And it were 5 panels in it that represented the human and natural resources of the area, northeastern Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and the upper peninsula. Well, I took one look at how hard she had been working on that. I said, "Jerry, we can't do this to the poor sister." So we made arrangements to put the art piece on display in a downtown Duluth store window on Monday. And then we got the head of the school, St. Scholastica. She was a sister of St. Scholastica. And we got the president and Sister Carmelita sitting in the front row, and we were going to present this to Secretary Freeman on behalf of President Kennedy. But wouldn't you know it that the band, this was at the Duluth Fieldhouse, so it was a large crowd. But wouldn't you know it that the band struck up "Hail to the Chief" before we could make this presentation to Secretary Freeman. And this was something that bothered me for many, many years, that this poor sister had been treated that way. So I got a hold of Jerry Haney, who's now passed away, but about 3 or 4 years ago, I called Jerry. I got to go and find out whatever happened to that piece of art. And so we went up and got a hold of the librarian, and it hangs in the library at St. Scholastica. This piece of art by this Catholic sister that was, the band struck up "Hail to the Chiefs" too soon. So, but both the sister and the head of the school are gone. But that, anyway, President Kennedy gave his speech. There were all kinds of I remember Mike Mansfield was in there because he was going on to Montana the next day. Duluth Hotel, of course, is not really what you would call a 5-star hotel. But I remember after President Kennedy's speech, We ended up in a suite, and it was President Kennedy and Secretary Freeman and Secretary Stuart Udall from the Interior Department. And that summer, the Soviets had had a bad wheat harvest, and so they were anxious to buy wheat from us. And then it became a contest of what kind of ships it would be shipped in. And the Seafarers Union, of course, they wanted it shipped in what they call American bottoms. But again, the feeling was that however it got there, they needed it because they were in need of wheat. There was a senator from South Dakota by the name of Carl Munt who got involved in that whole business, and I remember wrote to the president and to the Secretary of Agriculture that all the wheat should be shipped in American bottoms. And I recall the president and the two secretaries trying to figure out how they could finesse Carl Munt on what kind of ships that wheat should be shipped in. Kind of again, the decisions that are made that aren't ever public. So that's again one of the more interesting things. That was a month, you see, or 2 months before Dallas. And somehow, some reason, I got, maybe you asked why I'm involved in these kind of assignments. Well, basically it was because of my friend Tom Hughes, who was an assistant to Secretary Freeman and who was a dear friend from Minnesota. Anyway, after Duluth, I got tabbed to be part of the advance party to Dallas. And so we flew down to Dallas the day after Veterans Day in 1963. And there were 3 of us that were dropped off at each of the 5 locations where the president was going to be appearing. There was a Army Signal Corps person, there was a Secret Service agent, and a person like myself. The Dallas stop on that initial run-through was, we were the last ones to get off. We flew down on a MATS plane, a Military Air Transport Service plane. And the Signal Corps person was Chief Warrant Officer Art Bales. He got off the plane that night, and I've never seen him or heard from him since. The Secret Service agent's name was Win Lawson. And he and I shared a hotel room then in Dallas until the 23rd. There was some initial information that was already available. One is 2 things. They had looked at the trademark, and they were building out at the state fairgrounds. And the other thing that was requested was they wanted a motorcade through the downtown area of Dallas so that more people could see the president. The building at the state fairgrounds had a ceiling that was about this high, so it was not very impressive for a presidential appearance. The trademark had some questions because of its openness. But I remember the first day after we arrived in Dallas, meeting with some of the Dallas Citizens Council, who was the actual sponsor of the event. And that was interesting. And then we ran the motorcade route, went through, and I remember seeing that building that said Book Depository. And in my cynical kind of way, I said, that must be where they burn the books in Texas. But anyway, the Secret Service finally made a decision or a conclusion that they could protect the trademark. And that was a more logical route from Love Field to the downtown area to the trademark. So that got all figured out. And then you were dealing with the Democratic Party in Texas was at that time, may still be, three factions. One was a right-wing or conservative faction that was represented by the governor, John Conway. There was a moderate kind of faction that was dominated by Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House, and Lyndon Johnson, at that time the Vice President, of course. And then a more liberal faction represented by Ralph Yarborough, who was a United States Senator. So the question became there was a finite number of tickets that could be. This was going to be a luncheon, so there was a finite number of tickets that could be had for the luncheon, and the luncheon was really under the control of the Dallas Citizens Council. But there was a squabble between the Yarborough people, the moderate people, and the right-wing people on who was going to get tickets and who they wouldn't. The right-wing wouldn't sit on the head table next to this group, and it was a hassle to finally work things out. But it was finally all worked out, and the president arrived, and the crowd, as we went, I was in what they call a pilot car. I was out about 5 or 6 blocks ahead of the main motorcade. And I recall going through what they call the triple underpass area, and we just came out of the triple underpass area. It was a Dallas police car that I was in, and there came over the radio, police radio, to send all of the available police officers to the triple underpass area. And my immediate thought was that someone had thrown an egg or a tomato or something like that. But then we pulled over and stopped, and we pulled in right behind the Secret Service car that was behind the limousine, presidential limousine. And so I recall I saw them take the president out of the car and into the hospital. You could see that it was all over. Incidentally, if there are people who would like to spend some more time on the Kennedy assassination, which has been a topic of conversation for all these years, I'd be willing to contact a person that had contacted me about 40 years ago. Now, he was a young man, but his whole life has been developing and picking up on information about the assassination. So if there are people who would like to see that or visit with Rick, I'd be happy to have, and I know he'd be happy to come and visit with anyone here. So let's keep that in mind. Anyway, the Kennedy assassination again. I am not a historian, so I always preface what I'm about to say then. But that was the moment that the American dream kind of ended. Lyndon Johnson took over with a great deal of public affection and sympathy and hope. And in fact, he did, under his leadership, 2 rather significant pieces of legislation were enacted. One was civil rights, and 2 was Medicare. And then the Vietnam thing really destroyed him. And there's always the kind of there were 20,000 troops that had been sent to Vietnam under Kennedy. And so there's always the kind of question that you have, what would have happened in Vietnam had Kennedy not been assassinated? That's a question that no one has come up with an answer really yet. Lyndon Johnson, of course, gave up, was reelected by a large margin in 1964, and his vice presidential candidate and vice president was Hubert Humphrey from this state. Again, Hubert Humphrey was a most unusual individual. If Humphrey walked into a room like this, the aura of the room changed. He had a magnetic kind of personality that affected people. Interestingly enough, Humphrey again, the way Humphrey was treated by Lyndon Johnson during the 4 years that he was the vice president is really not very nice. He was shut out. His staff members couldn't even get into the White House, and then it became impossible for him to run for re-election. And that's kind of that's my feeling. Like I say, I'm not a historian, so what I say is my is opinion, not his history. And again, unfortunately, the 60s, the later 60s, the 70s, again, my kind of cynical observation is that the only decent human being that we've had for president in that whole interim is Jimmy Carter, who was a decent person and has conducted himself with great grace since he left office. He was left with some problems like the present president who inherited that are very difficult to deal with. Anyway, that's a brief. And my you have my my column here that I wrote on how I ended up in Walker Place. That's one of the things that I did in when I walked into the newspaper office up where I lived in Isanti County, and John Teddy, the editor, said, "Why don't you write a weekly column once in a while?" So this is number 61. So that my road has been full of curves and twists and turns, but I look back and I tell myself it's been a good journey, and I hope everyone else has a good journey. Thank you. And your questions are you? Yes.
Did you have an official job or position through all of this?
Oh yeah. I did. I was actually civil service, so that when Nixon was elected in 1968, I told myself that, well, I got shoved off, so I didn't do anything very much for 4 years. And I told myself that if Nixon was reelected in 1972, I was going to move back to Minnesota, which I did, and bought a farm. And I'm not a real farmer, but we bought a farm, and my daughter, who was 5 years old, had a chance to grow up on a farm and go to a rather small high school, and that was all for the better.
Well, my question was similar, and but I don't think that you really touched it. I wondered, in all of this, these situations where you were an insider, what was your official capacity? Did you have a title?
My title at Civil Service was Assistant to the Administrator, and that was ASCS, which was one of the agencies in the Department of Agriculture. I got pulled off essentially because I had some political experience. It wasn't official, but I was there.
When you said that the television stations all agreed to have one program,
Yes.
do you remember what that program was?
Yes, it included all of the state-endorsed candidates and all of the endorsed congressional candidates. So the public, wherever they turned, had a chance to see who the DFL had endorsed for governor, lieutenant governor, and so on, and each congressional delegation. In 1956, Stanley Hubert, who owned KSTP, refused to cooperate or participate, as you would have it, and so it wasn't nearly as effective as it was in 1954.
Was this just Democratic?
Yes, this was paid for by the DFL. Yeah, a different era, a different way of doing things.
Going back to the the one-room schoolhouse, go back to that and tell us more what life was like.
Well, I walked to school a little over a mile. Come rain or come shine. In the winter it was not very nice because in the cold days walking over a mile is not very much fun. Thank God for Mrs. Strike, who lived half a mile, because oftentimes she'd invite us in and give us the cookie that she just baked. So that was always kind of a plus. But can you imagine one teacher teaching 8 grades? The amount of attention that you could give to each individual student. Of course, there weren't many students. See, there were 4 that graduated the year that I did. The previous year, only 2 had graduated. Some years there wasn't any graduated. But you had recess. The school day was, let's see, you from 9 o'clock, and then you had a recess for 15 minutes, and then you had, depending on the time of the year, you had either a half hour or an hour for lunch, and you brought your own lunch. There was no school lunch programs back in the one-room schools. The teacher had to put wood in the stove to keep the place warm in the wintertime. And we used to play softball. And you'd choose up sides, and there'd be little guys and big guys playing there, and big girls and little girls playing the softball. I remember it was called kitten ball back in those days. But it was, you learned. Somehow you learned.
You mentioned taking, what was it, state tests in 7th
Yes.
or 8th grade. I went to school in Minneapolis at the same time, and I don't think we took any state tests in 7th or 8th grade. I'm wondering how you found yourselves in comparison to city kids as far as your education went.
Well, the only way you could judge that is that, see, Cambridge had its own school system, the town. And so there were town kids and rural kids. And I think rural kids did just as well as the town kids did academically. The one thing that you couldn't do is you didn't have a chance to participate in extracurricular activities, because when the bus left, kids didn't have cars that back then like they do today. So when the buses left, the rural kids had to go home. Now, I remember going out for baseball a couple of years, and we walked. It wasn't bad to hitchhike a ride from Cambridge to Isanti, but I know most of the time we used to walk the 3.5 miles from Highway 65 to where we lived. There's one other interesting little tidbit about the area in Isanti County where I grew up. There was a German Lutheran church, St. John's, that was built in 1882. It's still there and is now on the historic register. There was a cemetery there. And then there was a cemetery less than a mile down the road that we used to call the Keenitz Cemetery, because that was the name of the people whose land was next to the cemetery. And then across the section from St. John's was another cemetery, and there was a church building that I recall when I was a kid. And I once asked a person who lived near that church, he said, "Hugo, what kind of a church was that?" He said, "Well, it was kind of like Reverend Schuler." But I think what it really was a German Reformed church of some kind. That building is no longer there. But the funny story about the three cemeteries that are right close to each other is that the St. John's Church was built on 2 acres of land that the farmer had donated. His name was Gustav Kraus. And so the church got built, and they started to use the cemetery. And old man Cluck, who had buried a couple of his ancestors in that cemetery, Gustav Kraus started to encroach on the land he had donated for the church and cemetery. So old man Cluck got mad, and he dug up his people that he'd buried there and moved them down into the Keenitz Cemetery, started the Keenitz Cemetery. So here you have 3 cemeteries within a mile of each other. So that's living in rural America, as it once was. The other thing that's interesting is that today agriculture is so different. Back when I grew up, the typical farm was maybe 80 acres to 120 acres. And you had some cows that you milked, you raised some pigs, you had your own chickens, you provided a lot of your own foodstuffs, and then you sold what was surplus. My dad always planted about 1 acre of sweet corn each year. And so if we took the back seat out of the car, we could get about 100 dozen ears of corn in the back seat in the trunk. And then we'd pick that the day before, and then early in the morning we'd head for Minneapolis Central Avenue. We'd go off of Central Avenue a couple of blocks where there were residences. And my dad would have a bag full of corn, and I'd have a bag full of corn, and my brother would kind of keep track of the car. And we would sell that corn door to door, 10 cents a dozen, or 3 dozens for a quarter. So when I paid $3.75 for a dozen of corn, I remember those days. But that was the way it was.
I was, excuse me. I was born in St. Louis County, and of course that's the largest one in the state. County seat is Duluth, and I lived in Gilbert, went to school, elementary, all the way through high school in Gilbert. And our school system was known as Independent School District number 18 of District 27. And District 28, the principal school there was Hibbing and Chisholm. Well, I'm curious to know, being that was Isanti County, probably your main school was Cambridge. You went to high school there.
Yep.
Did you also have a so-called county school system, as was prevalent up in St. Louis County? You referred to that as being a rural school. Was it formally known as a county school?
The counties, the rural school districts came under the supervision, really, of a county superintendent of schools